So now let's take a look at what it will take to convert our repository factory into one that loads assemblies dynamically. First, let's look at our solution. We have a peopleviewer.basic application, and if we run this, it will look very similar to our previous applications. We have two buttons on the left-hand side and a list box on the right. And if we look at the code behind, we'll see this looks very similar to the way that we last left our class. We'll see that this fetch data method is very much like we left it. The primary difference is that our repository factory.getRepository method does not take any parameters, but we are still relying on the interface iPersonRepository, and we are calling the getPeople method on that object. Now again, our goal here is to do runtime binding. What that means is that if we look at our peopleviewer.basic project, we do not have any assembly references to concrete repositories. The only repository reference we have is personrepository.interface, and that's the one that defines our interface, but we do not have anything referencing our service repository or our CSV repository or our SQL repository. So let's flip over to our repository factory. What we have right now is just an empty method, so we actually need to fill this in. So as we mentioned, our first step is to get some information out of configuration. So we'll create a variable called typename, and we'll use our configuration manager to get one of our app settings out, and this will be called repository type. And what this will mean is we're looking for a specific value in our app.config file. If we take a look at that, we'll see that we have an app settings section, and notice we have a key called repository type. For the value, we have our fully qualified concrete type, personRepository.service.service repository. Along with this, we have the information of what assembly to find it in, personRepository.service with the version and the culture. So this is the information we need in order to dynamically load the assembly. So back in our factory, we just need to take this string and turn it into a type. We'll call it repo type, and we'll set this equal to type.getType, and this will be type name, the value that we're getting out of configuration. The next step is to create an instance of this using the activator class. This uses reflection to dynamically generate an instance of whatever type we give it. Now this returns an object, so we'll say object repo instance equals activator dot create instance, and then we'll pass in our type repo type. So this will give us back an instantiated service repository based on our current configuration. Now all we need to do is cast this to an iPerson repository. So we'll call this repo, and we'll take our repo instance, and we'll say as iPerson repository. Now when you use the as statement, if repo instance happens to be something else, not an iPerson repository, this will just return null. And then we just need to return our iPerson repository instance. Let's go ahead and build and make sure everything's happy there. And we have a successful build. Now, as long as we're looking at the build output, notice right above the build succeeded, there's a message, 10 files copied. Where does that come from? Well, I actually have a post-build step in the project. So if we look at our build events, what this is doing is actually copying files from one folder to another. So even though we don't have compile time references to these assemblies, we still need to get them into our output folder somehow. So if we open up our output folder, we go to bin debug, what we'll see is our repository assemblies are here. So here's our personRepository.csv, personRepository.service, and personRepository.sql. And again, the reason these are in our output folder is because we're explicitly copying them over from another folder that already has these assemblies in them. So let's go ahead and run our application, and I'll just do it from the output folder. When we click on the button, we'll see the result is that we are actually using the service repository. And of course, we do have our valid output as well. But watch this. Here's our peopleviewer.exe.config file. Let's go ahead and just open up this file. And notice our application settings up here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to comment out the section that has the information for our service repository, and I'm going to come down here to the section for our CSV repository. Now note, we do have that same key repository type, but now the value is pointing to the fully qualified person repository.csv.csv repository. And again, we do have a value that tells our CSV repository where to find its data in the people.txt. So now if we run our executable again, and again, I didn't recompile, I just changed configuration. What we'll see is now we're running off the CSV repository. And again, we do have that extra record to make sure we're pulling from that people.txt file. And of course, we can do the same thing with our SQL repository. So let's go ahead and do that. So we'll comment this out. And we will uncomment the section for our SQL repository. Our repository type is now personRepository.SQL.SQL repository. And then we have the information for the connection string so it knows where to find the data. So let's go ahead and save this and go back to our output. And if we double click on this, we'll see that we now hit the SQL repository. Now we're really starting to see the power of this. All we need to do if we need additional repositories is to create the assembly, such as personRepository.Oracle, personRepository.NoSQL, and put those into the output folder, and then update the configuration. We don't have to rebuild our code. The other advantage is that we only need to distribute the assemblies that we're actually using. So for example, if I really was using just the CSV repository, I would have no reason to deliver the service or the SQL DLLs. We can just deliver the repository assemblies that we're actually going to use. So now we can see we have a completely decoupled application. We're programming to an interface and then dynamically loading the concrete types. This is extremely powerful.